So thank you all for your patience. Thank you for joining me today to celebrate this release of this book that I worked on for some time. And I really appreciate you for taking the time to join me here today. So I think I want to start by just saying that I was instructed by my teacher to write this book for a couple different reasons. One was he wanted people to know that there's not really any difference between Eastern and Western esoteric spirituality. That the only real difference is between traditions that are pursuing wisdom and those that are not pursuing wisdom. And those are wisdom pursuing traditions and non-wisdom pursuing traditions are found in both the East and the West. So yeah, the differences that we notice are primarily like just linguistic, cultural, and things of that nature. But so the idea is that if something works, it will work theoretically for anyone, anywhere, at any time, because that's what efficacious means in a sense. And so my teacher wanted me to express that perspective, and he wanted people who are interested in esoteric spirituality in the West to know that there are actual methods that exist that are capable of producing transformation in people. And I think I was really a good person to write the book because I'd spent so many years pursuing Western esoteric spiritual traditions and different practices and hearing teachings and talking to different teachers and really trying to distill some sort of essential view and practice and way of doing it all. And I was never able to even approach anything like that. And it's not that there weren't a million different practices or paths or different traditions that offered, a wide variety of beliefs and deities and mythologies, and they're very rich. But what I didn't get was like an actual sense of a change in who and what I perceived myself to be. And it never really fully and completely answered any of the ultimate questions that I, even to this day, still think about a lot. Like, why are we here? What are we? What is this place? What is the purpose of it all? So when I met my teacher, I was pretty frustrated and feeling bitter and jaded and kind of like I was about ready, if that didn't work, to kind of like resign myself to, okay, I found a few practices that seem to do something, and I guess I'll just stick with those and that'll be that. But then I met him and he taught me these other practices and different ways of approaching the whole thing, which was really the essential difference. But at its core, the nature of that difference was the fact that he's already accomplished the path from beginning to end. So he'd already attained the thing that I was trying to do. And so that in itself really, I think, is ultimately the thing that has been the main difference. Is we talk about gnosis, we think about it, we read about it, we hear about it, but unless it's sitting in front of you telling you what it is and then demonstrating what that means in action, it's just really almost impossible to get a sense of what it means, you know. And just as an example, like, I have this tendency where I want to assume that gnosis is somehow equivalent with our ideas of perfection or whatever that would be. But that's not true, because gnosis can only occur in a human body mind. And so a human body mind is inherently not perfect, can't be perfect, because the body has, you know, is corruptible, it's impermanent. So perfection doesn't even enter into the realm of possibility, even when we're talking about enlightened wisdom beings who are essentially like the divine embodied, because there's no other way for the divine to know itself in that way. So it's still possible for someone to embody divinity, as crazy as that sounds, and not be perfect in a human sense. And that sounds crazy to say too, but that's actually just how it is. And you know, so that it kind of shatters my preconceptions, and then like there's a million other preconceptions that get blown away as well. So that's kind of where I wanted to begin, at least talking about the book. When I mentioned to my teacher that I was going to be having this conversation, he said, just give the straight talk. Don't ever hold back or buffer, soften anything for anyone, but also make very clear there is a workable option that works and is tried and true and tested. So, yeah, I will try to be 100% honest with you, um, and tell you that it's very difficult and demanding, and that there's still a way for pretty much anyone who wants to actually do it. So that's where I guess I want to begin. So before we start talking about things like the great work and alchemy and things, does anybody have any questions at this point? No? All right. So really where the book begins and the spiritual path begins is kind of in this twofold basis, like, which is you want to be a better person, that you and everyone you know suffers on like an existential level. And we can talk more about what that means, but essentially at its root is a innate knowledge that the divine is real and that we feel some degree or level of separation from that. And so that's really at the root of it, but that takes many forms because the way we embody that feeling of separation is through this desire. We have desire for things or relationships or ways of being, different things, and we desire them, and we think that they're going to make us happy, and they might for a time, but they never really satisfy that ultimate sense of separation that we feel from the ultimate. Um, and so, like, this cycle of the pursuit of the object of the desire, and then the sort of realization that that's not the thing that's going to do it, and so it really produces this kickback feeling where, the more you get of something that you don't really need, like, it never satisfies. It's, instead of like filling a hole, it's like you're digging a hole. Instead, you're trying to fill a hole, and you end up creating a bigger one. And that's probably the closest metaphor I could describe for how it feels. Other metaphor would be like the feeling like, you're in a really uncomfortable place, and you see a door with an exit sign above it, and you go out through the door, and instead of being an exit, it's actually an entrance right back into the same place. And as you get more desperate, you're like rushing through that door quicker and quicker, and finding yourself back in the same place over and over again. So in order to sort of escape that cycle, all of the ancient mystery schools had this prescription, if you will. And there were aspects to it, but the primary one that even today we still recognize is this idea of self-knowledge, of knowing oneself. And I think it's interesting because when I think about knowing myself, even now, I still think about, well, knowing my personality, my tendencies, my like idiosyncrasies, my preferences. But that's not really what knowing yourself is about. Knowing yourself turns out to be more knowing the ways that we all, as human beings, tend to behave, act, think, feel, and develop narratives about ourselves and stories about ourselves, that it's about like a self-concerned feedback loop. And so self-knowledge really revolves around understanding how we kind of behave mechanically, that we rely on routines and time, and we use time and space as a way to, as like handrails or crutches, to allow us to sleepwalk through our day and ultimately our life, if we let it. And that's, unfortunately, that's not really being alive. Like having this constant longing for something that you sort of perceive but can't really get your handle on, and sort of distracting oneself into not having to think or consider the full implications of that situation. So all of the ancient sages would talk about, knowing yourself, and then knowing the ways that you did this. And this is similar to how Christ in the Gospel of Thomas would say something along the lines of, look, and when you look, when you seek, you'll be disturbed or distressed when you seek. And then if you keep seeking through that, then you will reign over all. And really, that's looking at ourselves, seeing the way that we deny the truth of divinity once we are able to recognize it, And then it's really kind of coming to grips with that. Um, so that's really what is, a major aspect of what we think of as the great work, this idea of evolution beyond our normal capabilities, because our typical human capabilities is really just, you know, reproduce, sustain our bodies and minds so we can reproduce and perpetuate the species. But individual self growth, maturation, or evolution beyond that involves individual effort. And that involves looking at ourselves, understanding who and what we are, and then sort of working to train the mind and the body to live the truth of it. So one of the things that I talk about in the book that I think is kind of lacking in terms of Western traditions is this real articulation right up front about the view of reality. I mean, all traditions and paths have a view, but they don't all articulate it clearly right at the beginning. So in this instance, if we're talking about Buddhist Tantra, the view is that all is divinity coming to know itself in a sort of a playful frolic. And that's pretty radical view because it precludes beings and beingness. And it even precludes any idea of substance material phenomena as well. But it then says, there's a problem here. And the problem is that we habitually mistake divinity as us in a world filled with other people and things. And so the function of the spiritual path then becomes to, you could use the word purify or the word transform our perception of reality into that of divinity knowing itself, rather than me as an individual person knowing my own thoughts, feelings, and perceiving other people and objects in a 3D field around me that lacks ultimate meaning and can never have ultimate meaning. So articulating those three things, the view, the problem, and the function of the spiritual path, I think is helpful because you have an idea of like, okay, well, what does this path say is reality? Like, can I even buy into that in the first place? Do I agree that there's a problem or that this is the problem? And then if so, then there's a path to actually remedy this problem. And then then it becomes important that you have a teacher who's actually attained this and is this, who can say, yes, this is true. And I can tell you it's true because I'm right here sitting in front of you and I've done it. And so that is also something that I wish that I'd been able to find before, but is in just integral, crucial element in the whole process. So I think that is kind of a beginning summation of the great work, but there's obviously other aspects to it. The major one that I want to mention also is this idea of virtue and virtuous conduct, because this becomes like, once you recognize the view and the problem and that you need a solution, being the spiritual path, it becomes an issue of like, what do I do? Like, how do I actually begin to change? And so then this idea of virtue becomes paramount, because as I mentioned in the beginning, like one of the basis for the spiritual path is you want to be a better person. And inherently becoming a better person means being and becoming ever more virtuous, making virtuous conduct a habit instead of something that you practice. Sometimes people find this idea odd or surprising, but those of you who are familiar with Freemasonry, I think probably already assume this is the case, because in Masonic teachings, it's, especially in the first 3 degrees, really emphasize these ideas of virtue and virtuous conduct and ways of behaving and thinking, attitudes, and ways of being that are incredibly transformative. Because when you're able to think and speak and act in accord, and it's all virtuous, it's all with compassion, it's all designed with caring for others instead of self-concern, then it begins to actually change who and what we perceive ourselves to be. I don't think I could really explain exactly the mechanism of how that works, except to say, if you've done it, I think you know what I'm talking about, or if you haven't, you should try it and see, because it's really remarkable and incredibly simple. So I don't know, does anyone have any questions or comments about the great work or virtue or any of the things I've been blabbing on about at this point?
Hey, Greg, it's Chad.
Hey, Chad.
When you mentioned the great work, I mean, we're gathered here in the Chamber of Reflection. I've been a member for about 3 or 4 years now following this. So I think a lot of esoteric searchers may be surprised at the path you chose to go down. They're like, oh, Buddhism, I'm interested in esoterics, not really understanding. And I'd also like to mention, like, comparing the great work to what Aleister Crowley is talking about. It's been a long time since I've really studied OTO and Thelemite theology, but I would think maybe an OTO member would be like, oh, what you're talking about is crossing the abyss. When we cross the abyss, we do the same thing that you and your book are talking about. So, what would you say to that person? How would you differentiate the great work Crowley's talking about and what you're talking about? Or is there any difference along with the whole abyss thing?
So I think there is a difference that's significant, but it might be more perceivable from my side than from the other person's side. Like, it's very common to encounter a reaction to this sort of thing that I'm talking about here as, oh, yes, this is familiar to me. I know what you're talking about. The tradition that I practice, we do the same thing. I've had that reaction before from people, and I see it pretty regularly. And even Ouspensky in his book, The Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution, mentioned, I think in the very first chapter, that, and he was addressing people in a public talk, and he was saying that you're going to hear this and you're going to turn it into something that you think you already understand. And he's like, this is part of the mechanical nature that I'm actually talking about now. He said, you'll hear what I'm saying. It's radical. You've never encountered it before anywhere else. And you're going to turn it into something you think you already understand, because acknowledging and admitting that it's radical and new and that it's possibly real is a problem. And it's a problem because if it's real, you have to change your whole life. But that's what wisdom is. Real wisdom presents you with an unshielded view of reality. In the same way my teacher was telling me this morning, tell it to them straight. Don't couch it. Don't, soften it. Just give it to them straight. And so what happens is when you're presented with real wisdom, you're presented with reality as it is, you don't have a choice. You have to change your whole life and way of being, because what happens if you don't? You're living a lie. And then you're living a lie. And then every moment that you don't admit, acknowledge, recognize, understand, and live the truth becomes another step towards your grave. And that's unfortunately just the way it is. So what I would say to someone who thinks that they're doing this already is, you can't know until you try it. You really can't know until you try it. And I wish people could know. But that's just how growth and wisdom works. You can't change by just hearing me talk about it. You can't change by participating in a ritual. I'm not saying these are all not part of a larger process. They are, but these individual things don't do it. You actually have to undergo and submit yourself to the path, not as you want it to be, or you think it should be, or as Crowley said it should be, but in the way that those who have actually attained gnosis say it needs to be. Because that's the thing, someone who has attained gnosis and it like lives in the stability of that realization, they are like reality itself. So when they speak about spirituality, they're experts and they know what works, what doesn't, what the problem is, and how to overcome it. So unless the tradition that somebody's following is producing enlightened beings regularly, reliably, repeatedly, then one should assume it's not the same, and it's not doing the same things, and the practices are not, maybe not geared towards that goal, which is fine. I mean, not everybody is pursuing gnosis as their intention, and so that's okay. But if someone wants to or thinks they are, they should really look closely at what they're doing and why they're doing it, and if anyone else has been successful, attained gnosis doing what they're doing. And if so, they should immediately try to get in touch with that person and find out how, why, what they did, if they have any tips. I don't know. So yeah, when you say like OTO or Crowley's teachings, I think on some level he was pursuing gnosis, but on another level, like to me, his writings don't actually demonstrate a stable attainment of that. And so we don't see any enlightened masters coming out of the Thelemic traditions at this point, and I haven't. And I don't mean that it's not possible that maybe someday it could happen, but I'm not sure that that's actually what people there are really trying to do specifically. A lot of it falls more under the guise of knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel, which to my mind is an actually separate, distinct process. And it's not to say it couldn't be part of a larger path, but it's not gnosis. And I like that Rumi quote about, I'm the slave of that one who does not mistake every rest stop for the end of the path. So I guess that's how I would answer that, Chad. I don't know. Do you have any reactions or?
I do. It actually brought up something you brought up in the book. There is no end. It's not like, boom, I've had the thing, I've got the knowledge or the experience or the gnosis, and I'm done. That's not right. It just keeps on and keeps on going.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly how much I should share, but I mean, I just in the last week, I've been around and talked to two practitioners who've already attained gnosis, and they're both still doing practice every day, both of them. And I mean, there's no question about like, oh, am I done? Have I finished? Like, it's not even like a consideration. There's no finishing, there's no ending. So yeah, I think to think of it as an ending would be wrong, because it's really a whole new beginning. I would say is more accurate. It's a new beginning into a new understanding and realization of how much work actually needs to be done, instead of what seemed like a lot of work to get to that point. Yeah. Does anybody else have any comments or questions?
Yeah, Florian here. So how to distinguish between somebody who, is, let's say, honest about their not being a finishing point and publishing works which might be confusing because they don't look like somebody who claims to have done it all, and somebody who is actually not yet, accomplished. We've had the example of the OTO just now. Basically, how do you judge whether somebody is the real deal or confusing themselves or fooling others?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I think you have to spend time with the person in a variety of contexts, both in public and private. I think you have to read their writing. I think you have to talk to people who know them. I think you have to more or less not live with them, but at least live close to them, live around them, so that you see them at variety of points throughout the day, and that you are able to have enough access to them to question them. I don't know. I think that's really the best I could say. I don't think you should ever take it on faith that someone is an enlightened master, because there's too many people who claim that don't seem to be the real deal. I mean, to me, I think when I think of my teacher, he's not trying to find new students. He's actually trying to get rid of the old students who he already has, like literally trying to get rid of them and make them leave. He doesn't want money, and the money he does get, he just gives it away or helps other people. He doesn't really want any fame or notoriety. Like, he would never do what I'm doing right now, because he has no interest in it, and the possible complications of it would be too great, like from a karmic responsibility sense. So, I mean, to me, those are like certain ways I can tell that I think, a person is the real deal or actually the master, because then they can demonstrate it through their realization and things that they know and are able to teach or do in certain situations. And yeah, I don't know. At a certain point, I think if you've been doing this for a while, you begin to just be able to perceive it on a physical level. Like, just being around a being like that it's not like being around a normal person. There's like a variety of interesting effects and phenomena. And so there's all kinds of subtle things too. So, but again, you'd never even begin to notice those unless you're around all the time. So I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, I can relate to some of these things you said. I have a related follow-up question. In some tradition and certain traditions, and especially Buddhism, it's actually not done to claim any attainments. So especially the ordained Buddhists won't actually say, I've attained to whichever insights or gnosis, because it's against the monastic laws they took.
Right.
And there's other traditions who more or less mirror this, where you don't speak about these things, basically, which, well, even you mentioned that just now, that you were thinking whether to mention something, which you then told, which, thank you. So is this useful, do you think, or is this an obstacle to people realizing that, these things are not just spoken about in old texts, but actually done today? The example you mentioned at the beginning, or not at the beginning, but when I managed to join, of actually seeing such a person and getting the confidence that they actually represent something which is out of the ordinary. So if they are not allowed or not inclined to speak about it, is this useful? Is it a useful way of veiling oneself, basically, or is this some kind of spiritual coyness or something?
You have to consider the context that these things happen. So like if you have a monastic situation where the masters don't talk about it and they don't share anything and you don't know, um, like I don't know, but my speculation is that those situations with monks and nuns exist in within a societal context that most of the regular people in the society have a pretty strong degree of faith, religious faith.
Mhm.
So the purpose isn't to try to recruit more monks and nuns to then like realize ultimate wisdom. It's really to just, do the work that needs to be done to keep people alive and keep everything moving forward. Um, in this situation, um, we are in a context where many people have a great interest in esoteric spirituality and by extension gnosis, and yet by and large we lack the view, the methods, the conduct, the teachers that could actually help us realize that. And so if I'm telling you things or revealing things, or my teacher is like more coming out of the closet, so to speak, it's because there's is the possibility of protecting something, keeping it so secret that you kill it, right? And so if you keep it so secret that nobody knows about it or nobody believes it's real, what good is it? Like, does it actually do any good in the world? And right now we're talking about trying to reach people who have a sincere, authentic aspiration to learn more, to grow, to hopefully realize wisdom. And so we're almost compelled to reveal it and share it. Because if we don't, then I feel like that would be a massive failure. Like if I had to go through all of the practices I did for years and the experiences I had and the things I learned, and to not communicate that to other people would be like trying to hoard something, that doesn't belong to me. And like thinking that if I can just keep it secret, that I'll protect it and it'll be safe. But wisdom doesn't need protection, and it ultimately keeps itself secret, because a lot of what I'm talking about is ultimately subtle enough that if someone were so coarse that they heard this, but it's likely they wouldn't really even grasp the importance or the significance of it, or understand how to put it into action in such a way that it would be beneficial. So at some point you have to ask, like, what is the point of hiding it? Ultimately, like when it's hidden, from my perspective, it's hidden because the people who it's intended for is a very limited group. A group of people who are capable of actually understanding it and using that information. So really, I think that is really what it comes down to in terms of like secrecy or revealing or not revealing. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, sure. The societal aspects you mentioned, that's a good thing. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Does anyone else have any other question or comment?
Greg, this is Chad. I'm going to jump back in. You just mentioned the word self-secret, and it brought up another question that I had, that this is a self-resultant path. And one of the parts of the book I found very interesting was when you got to talk to a student of Nisargadatta, and that he had told you that what good is a diamond if you don't wipe the shit off of it. Okay. And then I wanted to parallel that with a different part of the book where Gunter is mentioning that Gnostic principle of uh, where we are, what we have lost, and where we are going. And with that self-resultant path, I think a lot of new people coming in are under the concept of, we're going to take our lead and we're going to turn it into gold. But that is not the case with what you're talking about. We are starting with a diamond, and we're simply wiping away the dirt off that diamond. So I was hoping you could speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So Vajrayana, or Buddhist Tantra, that is called the resultant path, because the result, which is gnosis, is present right from the beginning. It's not a seed. It's not something we have to like figure out, or we already are it. And the reason we are it is because that's reality. That's how reality is. Gnosis equals seeing reality as it is. And so one who has attained gnosis is that direct perception. So that's the view in the beginning, that's what's practiced, and that's the result, or the attainment, or the realization at the end. And again, being like a conceptual end, not an actual end. It's the end of the individual, not the end of the practice or the end of reality or anything else. So liberation is never of the person. The person never becomes liberated. The liberation is always from the person, which means from one's conceptual self-identity. Because when you see reality as it is, you see that there is no self in the way that we think of a self, and there are no beings in the way that we think of other people or things or animals or plants or what have you. And that there's not even any idea of a God in the way that we would normally conceive of that. So that's the result, and that's what it means when it says resultant path. And in terms of like the Gunther quote, I mean, he's really connecting it like with a more widely known idea of gnosis in the ancient world. So it's not a gnosis that's somehow limited to Buddhism or Vajrayana or Guru Rinpoche. This is gnosis in the sense that gnosis is gnosis. It doesn't matter what tradition has been used to realize it, because reality is reality, period. So it doesn't, you know what I mean? So I don't know if that really answers your question or if that helps, but.
It does. But I just wanted to make sure that when he said where we are, what we've lost, where we're going, that's not like some, it's hard to put into words, like a point A to a point B thing. It's like you already are it. It's just a matter of dropping the delusion.
Yeah, so that's why I said what's the function of the spiritual path? So the spiritual path is a way to remedy the problem of a mistaken perception. And even mistaken is really not the right word. Words don't ultimately work in describing truth, but it's the our perception of separation and individuality and not seeing everything as divinity. That's what one comes to in seeing reality as it is. And that's not something that wasn't always already the case, right? Reality doesn't change like and suddenly switch around because someone has attained enlightenment. No, it's just the opposite. Their own self-identity has unraveled enough that they can see it as it is and always has been and always will be. Right. So that's why what you're talking about when you say it's not a linear path or progression, and it's not turning lead into gold. It's changing your understanding so that you can actually perceive that there was never any lead to begin with. It was always gold, that there's nothing but gold. There's always been only gold, and it's only our habitual way of like separating out everything into specific things that makes it not seem like gold, and gold here being a metaphor for the divine.
That's good. Thank you. One final thing, and I'll stop hogging the mic, but your teacher told you this morning, tell it to them straight. What do you think is like the hard stuff that people with a good heart coming into this with the best intentions are going to hear about the truth that they don't necessarily like, that they have a really hard time with? But that's tough shit. This is the way it is.
Well, the main thing is that it's not actually about you, and it's not about any idea of like growth or self-improvement, and that your treasured self, that part of ourselves that we hold dear, the part that we love and the part that we hate, all of it is actually the obscuration and the hindrance to being enlightened. And so that's the difficult part, is you have to undo yourself to get there. And it's like I said before, liberation is never of the person, it's always from the person. And so I think that's the most difficult part, because that inherently means that the function of the guru or the spiritual master is to have a critical gaze and point out all the things that you do, all the tendencies you have that undermine your potential to see reality, to see truth. And that's can be incredibly painful, because first of all, you have to submit to another, what looks and seems like a human being who is clearly not perfect, as I said at the beginning. Like, perfection doesn't even enter into it. So then you have to submit yourself to the instruction of what looks like a person who's telling you not to do all the things you want to do, and to do a bunch of things that you don't want to do. And often telling it to you in a harsh and way that is difficult to hear. Because if it doesn't sting a little bit, you're just, this is how we are. We don't learn from everything going great. A sword is not forged in a feather bed, right? It's made with a furnace and an anvil and a hammer. And like, the spiritual path is that. So it's difficult, it's challenging, and it's often not fun. So I guess that's the part that, and I guess the other hard part is that, despite people's best intentions and aspirations, most people aren't capable of doing it. Even those that want to, many aren't capable. And I don't know why that is. It just is. So that's hard to hear too. It's hard to hear there is a way that works, but you might not be able to work it yourself. It requires really like a complete submission. And that's the hardest thing. Like, can you submit to life on its own terms and not your terms? And that's hard.
Yeah. Thank you,
So,
Greg. Well
you're
said.
welcome. Andrew, I think you had a question or comment.
Yeah, I think you've addressed a lot of it. I mean, I guess I would just like to hear your personal experience or perspective about that type of loop to the exit scenario that you described. Because what I've experienced is that there's a potential tension between self-knowledge and then that desire for self-improvement, where the self-improvement desire for self-improvement is in and of itself mechanical. And but at the same time, self-satisfaction doesn't get you anywhere either. So I don't know, how is your understanding of that potential conflict developed?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And again, this is why the spiritual master is important, because they've already done what you're trying to do. So they know exactly what it is and how to do it and what the problems are that preventing you from doing it. So it's not really possible for somebody to do this for themselves, I guess, is what I'm saying. Even though it would be great if we could, because then we'd all be already enlightened. You know what I mean? There's no way for us to really see or understand or recognize when we think we're being authentic and we're really hiding a part of ourselves from ourselves. Yeah, I feel like there's no way that we can see it and know it and then do anything about it. Like, even if we were able to see it, it's possible we might not be able to change it. Like, these tendencies often they manifest in ways that we don't actually notice them. And this is why, like, in the Gurdjieff work, they have this practice of self-remembering, where it's like you just sit and you think, like, and I am here, or it maybe not even am, it would just be I here, and just focus on the feeling of I here and try to, like, hold your attention in the center of your chest or your heart and just feel that feeling of being present for 5, 10, 15 minutes. And it's actually quite difficult. And if you try it, you'll notice that holding the attention on ourselves is hard. And it's even harder if we're trying to do anything. And it's almost impossible if we're talking or interacting with other people. So what that tells us is that we generally are not fully aware or conscious of ourselves in every moment, which means that we're pretty much sleepwalking through our life all the time. So I don't know if that is really going to get to the heart of it, but I think that there's no way to really prevent yourself from doing those things unless you can have a person who is like already mastered this so well that they know it, they can see it in you, they recognize it immediately, they can tell you how to stop it, or at least start to enact a process to change it. Like it's really way beyond any of our capability, unfortunately. So
Thank you for clarifying that.
yeah, you're welcome. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments? So we have a few more minutes left. I just wanted to mention, like, there was a couple other sections from the book I thought were relevant, at least in this conversation, in terms of alchemy. I feel like alchemy is a really great analog for Tantra and the spiritual path generally, because of the way there's just so many aspects to it that really fit so well, from the whole point of view of there's a secret process whereby which man can begin to understand the way that nature actually functions, both in himself and his mind and in the world, that it uses this analogy of laboratory alchemy as sort of a model for the spiritual practices and meditative practices and contemplative practices, but also actually uses real alchemical substances as a means to supplement the spiritual practice at the same time. So it's actually quite a holistic art or discipline in that way, because it's so multifaceted and self-reflective. And I think that's essentially, why they adopted Mercury as the ultimate symbol of the sort of wisdom, or this way of transmission that alchemy affords us. And so I think it's beautiful. And the idea that the prima materia is analogous, like in Tantra, you have the idea of what you could say is like the ground of all being, and that from which all phenomena arises and falls back to. And you have the idea of the elixir of life, which would be, at least in my mind, analogous to what you would call amrita, or this bliss nectar that is the result of meditative practice and is transformative in and of its own right. And then the philosopher's stone, which is really the heart mind of the enlightened being that shines out and essentially is capable of transforming reality, which is really means is that it's capable of recognizing reality as it is and then bringing others into a proper relationship with that, or a perception of that. So I love the way that that works, and the whole way of seeing the body as the alchemical chamber, where the fluids are moving through and bubbling and heating and purifying. And that's really, that's totally just like tantric practice. So I think that whole analogy is really beautiful. And then I also write in the book about this idea of rebuilding Solomon's temple, which is the central mythology of Freemasonry and the way that the body mind is the temple, you know, the house not made with hands, and the various aspects and ways that we approach that work. You know, and the first of which is really seeing it as divine work, seeing it as work that is being undertaken to serve the divine, because that's what the spiritual path is, and that's what it brings us to. So when I said, like, it's not about you, that's what I mean. It's about ultimately serving the divine, and that means serving beings, and that means that the idea of compassion is no different than enlightenment. And that's what you find in the Sanskrit word bodhicitta, which is the word for compassion, but literally means enlightened mind. So we say wisdom and compassion, but really those are not two different things. They may be two different words, but they're not really different. Like, we could say compassion is wisdom and action, but compassion in and of itself is only seems actional from the practitioner, even though it's not. So I don't know. I think that's probably my thoughts on it. Well, I want to thank you all for joining me, and I appreciate your patience and listening attentively and asking such good questions. So I appreciate it very much. And if you do have any questions or comments or anything you want to talk about that comes up after this, feel free to send me an email or a message on Facebook or Discord, and I'll gladly try to answer you as best I can. And I hope you all have a great rest of your weekend. So thank you.